So for this next part, we're going to talk about one of those unique scenarios that you only face in live poker that the Sims cannot really prepare you for, as this is not a theoretical play that a computer would ever make or a Type 1 player would ever make, but still a spot that we have to deal with in poker tournaments, high stakes poker tournaments, especially when playing against recreational players. And I'll show a couple examples here of this specific spot, but it's something I've seen a lot of over the years and didn't have a great grasp on initially, as we'll see in this first hand. And a spot that, when it does come up, is often in big pots. Obviously, we'd like to make the correct decision in big pots deep in tournaments. So, this is something that I consider to be a fairly valuable exploit. Although it doesn't come up super often, just the fact that it does come up in such big spots, I put a lot of value on this specific scenario and navigating it properly. So the first hand we're going to look at comes from 25K high roller at Hard Rock about 5 or 6 years ago. Villain in question here is a Type 4 player, loose recreational. Folds around to us in the small blind. We have Ace 8 suited at 5K, 10K, playing about 50 blinds effective. We open for 35K from the small blind, and big blind 3 bets us to 90K, and we call. So nothing too out of the ordinary there pre-flop. I think baseline Ace 8 suited, small blind 50 effective, we're probably limping a good deal. Versus this specific opponent, kind of weak, loose player, I do prefer coming in for the 3.5x open, getting more money in the pot, heads up with a good hand is the right play here most of the time, and I'm going to lean towards raising more than calling here. So as played, when I open here and get 3-bet, I'm going to call with Ace 8 suited. And we get an Ace 2 5 flop, rainbow. Now 190K in the pot. I check, and big blind is all in for 410K. And naturally, our first thought is, what the fuck? What's going on here? Usually in this scenario, we're facing a third pot bet, or even smaller these days, playing against studied opponents. So when we do face this huge bet on the dry texture, how do we make sense of it? How do we range our opponent? What is he trying to accomplish here? And I think when the cards get rolled over here, you guys will be quite surprised at the actual hand our villain has here. Because when we're trying to range our opponent here, he 3-bet us pre-flop. He is a Type 4 player, so his range is not too snug here pre-flop, but does contain hands like aces, ace king, ace queen, ace jack probably, kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines, and then maybe some other lower, weaker hands at some frequency. But definitely those hands are in the range and kind of the bulk of the basket of hands we're going to be thinking about. And of those hands, in this scenario, when I did face it the first time here, I was very concerned about ace king and ace queen, and playing this huge pot at this point in the tournament. It's really one of those binary things where we either have the best hand here by a lot, or we're way behind. It's kind of a 3-out, 2-out scenario. And I had trouble finding hands opponent would be bluffing with here on this ace 2 5 texture, where I thought it would be completely ludicrous. He might have queen jack suited or something, some kind of blocker to my ace jack, or backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. Even a hand like pocket fours seems unlikely. I had a real hard time coming up with bluffs villain had here, and ended up folding. So I'll take a second here to give you guys a little exercise. I'm going to pause for 1 second here and see if you can come up with what villain did have here, because he did show me after I folded. Take a second here and try to think of a hand he might have here. Did you come up with pocket kings? Because in this scenario, villain actually turned over kings and kind of sincerely told me, don't worry, I had it, good fold. Which tells you a lot about the player's thought process here in this spot, in the sense that he was not bluffing in his mind with these pocket kings. So that's something I've thought about a lot when putting myself in my opponent's shoes in this scenario, it's not a logical play or makes any sense from a strategical standpoint. It's it's kind of a momentum play based off having the lead pre-flop and then having a strong hand and not changing your strategy and adapting to the new information on the flop. Kind of this overcard coming where kings on the ace high board, strategically when you make these huge shoves for more than the pot with pocket kings on an ace high board, you're only going to get called when you're beat. I'm not going to call here with pocket queens or a 5 here in this scenario ever. When I do call, I'm going to have him dead. So this play does not make any sense, but they're doing it out of kind of a panicky pressure to end the hand, where new information has come to light. I don't like it. I'd like this hand to be over. I'm all in. It's kind of the way I make sense of it in my opponent's head. And this is actually a play I've seen a lot, even at high stakes and 25K, 100K tournaments. Something that recreational players will favor, and definitely a consistent pattern. A player who makes plays like this will always make a play like this. I would say it's tough to say always in poker, but will very frequently make this play if faced with the same scenario. It's a high frequency thing. So knowing that, we really need to put some time into what kind of identifiers we can use to make the right assessment when we are in this spot, and then our response and what are we going to do? What are we going to call with when we do face this situation again? The triggers are kind of identifiers that you're entering into this scenario will be a type 4 or 5 villain you're playing a pot against. Usually villain is the last aggressor pre-flop in this scenario. Usually that means 3-better, although this can happen in single raise pots or 4-bet pots. I've seen it most frequently as villain being the 3-better. But the SPR is always going to be low, kind of 1 to 3, where they're going to be shoving for more than a pot size bet, but usually not more than 3x a pot size bet. And those are kind of the 3 general identifiers that are always true when I found myself faced with this spot. Occasionally you'll see something like this as like a stop and go out of position, but fairly rare. Most of the time this happens with the player in position as the 3-better or re-raiser and low SPR. And our response to this big shove, knowing that villain is going to have under pairs with a high frequency, is to disregard our kicker, where it doesn't really matter if we have ace worst kicker or ace king in that scenario. If our opponent is shoving kings, queens, and jacks with full frequency, we're not really as worried about him having ace king or ace queen here. And also, kind of, if we're thinking about his strategy in a nutshell, if he starts to bet smaller with ace king or aces or ace queen, or kind of splits his range into different sizings, which very well may be true and I believe to be true, and this shove starts to be only hands like kings and queens, then we really can't fold top pair. That's kind of our main takeaway when we do identify ourselves in this spot. We cannot fold top pair, even though the math and the theory kind of dictates, oh, we're calling 2x, 3x the pot. We need to be right very often, and we can only call a certain percentage of hands. And I think if a computer were assessing this spot, it may start calling with the higher kicker hands first and folding as they get down to weaker kickers. But my main point here in exploiting this play is the kicker doesn't matter, because you're going to see these underpairs a lot, and kind of spots where we're going to see it are 1 high card boards, I'd say. So ace high boards, king high boards, queen high boards, with kind of 1 face card usually, where opponents most likely holdings here are kings or queens on an ace high board, queens or jacks on a king high board, jacks on a queen high board, etc. So that's kind of the last trigger identifier, where there will usually be 1 ace or king or queen on the board, 1 high card. Let's look at an example of a hand where we actually identified it. This comes much later in my career, where we identified this correctly and made the right adjustment. So the second example comes in a Hard Rock Seminole main event, $3,500, played 2022. Again, playing against a Type 4 recreational, as this spot is specific to Type 4 and Type 5 players, and played at big blind 300 with around 40, 50 blinds. I opened the cutoff with ace 10 suited, button 3 bets to 2K, 2.5x. I call, I think business as usual there pre-flop. About 4,800 in the pot on the flop, and it comes ace queen 7 with 2 hearts. I check, and button is all in for 2.3, 2.4x the pot immediately again. That is one other factor that frequently comes up in these types of hands, this scenario. I don't want to say it's happens every time, but often villains play on the flop here is often quick, as they are building off of their momentum pre-flop. And I think part of it an emotional response of kind of being excited and worked up off having a big hand pre-flop. Although now on the flop, their hand value is obviously diminished in a relative sense. So me now, 5 years later, kind of identify, oh, this can very well be kings or jacks. And I call pretty quickly. Button has kings, and we hold here. So identifying this spot in the future, definitely very important. I bet some of you have already faced this spot in the past. Just something to keep an eye out, and let's not fold top pair in these scenarios.